Welcome to Real Estate and Taxes with Lakshay. I will be helping you minimize your taxes. Without further ado, let's get started. My name is Lakshay. Thank you for joining our 2 p.m. weekly Tuesday session on real estate and taxes. Today, we're going to be talking about everything that you need to know about the foreign buyer ban in Canada. Basically, a lot of you must have heard of the foreign buyer ban since it started, they announced it approximately last year, June, July-ish. So what is the foreign buyer ban? Technically, starting January 1, 2023, anyone who is a non-resident or non-Canadian, they were not allowed to buy a house in Canada. So let's assume you have someone who is on work permit, you have someone who is on a study permit, or someone who is basically a foreign investor. They were technically banned from buying anything in Canada when it comes to residential properties. There were some conditions that were applying to it, which we'll be talking about today, but for the most part, they were not allowed to invest in the Canadian real estate market simply because the Canadian government was thinking with the foreign investment coming in, the market price has been continuously going up in the real estate, and that has made it not affordable for Canadians to buy their first home. So today, we're going to be talking about what was the ban, what were the changes that were recently announced, which is March 27th, 2023, and how real estate agents as well as your new clients who are looking to buy within the Canadian market, how can they navigate this time? So without further ado, let's get started. So Canadian prohibition on the purchase of real estate residential property started in approximately January 1, 2023. This was technically only for residential units, meaning any dwellings which is 3 units or less. So anywhere where you're trying to invest a multi-level housing, multiplex, some people I know invest in Windsor area where they're buying a full development where there's 4 units right beside each other. You can still buy those units, but anywhere it was less than 3 dwellings or less, you were banned from buying it. So non-Canadians were not allowed to buy within the Canada. I'll be showing a map of what basically covers the Census Metropolitan Area. And if you're non-Canadian and you were caught of violating the prohibition, you could be fined up to $10,000 for buying or investing in something. Now a lot of people were wondering, what if someone got into an agreement of purchase and sale in December before their transaction, before the ban? If you got into an agreement in December of 2022 when the ban was not enacted, because the ban started on Jan 1, 2023, you could still go through with the transaction. They were still allowed to complete as long as you got into the transaction or the agreement of purchase and sale was signed before the ban started, which is Jan 1. So this is the Census Metropolitan Area. So this is the area where you're not allowed to buy a house. Now, a lot of people also ask me, what if you're trying to buy not a I know there's a ban on residential properties. What happens if I was trying to buy something like a cottage somewhere further up north? Would that also be considered under the ban? The answer is yes. You would still be not allowed to buy a cottage or a recreational property if they're under the Census Metropolitan Area. So what are some of the conditions that don't apply in this ban? So let's assume someone is going through a separation or a divorce, or someone was to gift the property to a non-Canadian. In that scenario, the non-Canadian can still acquire that property. And the second option is when a non-Canadian is actually renting a unit, even in that scenario, because they're not technically buying the house, they're exempt from this rule. And number 3 is if, let's assume, there's a seizure or there's a foreclosure happening and a non-Canadian is involved, even in that scenario, they will be basically exempt from this ban. So what are the new rules? On March 27, 2023, there were 2 new rules that were basically shared by the Canadian government. Number 1 was it will allow work permit holders to purchase a home while they're living in Canada. So the basic idea is you must be in the province or in Canada at least 183 days, basically working or have a valid work permit before you purchase this house. There were also 3 new rules where if you are buying the property for redevelopment purposes, if let's assume you're buying a vacant land, you weren't allowed to buy that before, but now you are able to buy a vacant land. You can also buy vacant land for redevelopment purposes or a residential property for redevelopment purposes where you're gonna basically build a custom home. And let's assume you form a corporation, and in that corporation you have a foreign party that is part of the corporation. If they have, before the announcement, it was 3% was the threshold of the foreign ownership, but now they have increased to to 10%. So a foreign entity can own 10% of the corporation, and you can still go ahead and start buying property. So those are the few rules that had changed. Let's take a deep dive into all of these rules because it's very important for all of the realtors in the market to kind of help their new clients that are basically investing from overseas. So number one, the foreign buyer ban no longer applies to most of the commercial real estate assets. Let's assume prior to the ban, if there was an urban land that was residential property, foreign buyers were not allowed to buy it. But now the ban will no longer apply to vacant land zoned for residential or mixed use. So this is a good development because someone who is basically has the money or is willing to invest and go into the building side or becoming a builder, now they're not banned even if they are non-Canadian. So that's a good news for Canadians because that will also create some new jobs as well, because someone can come bring over money from overseas, basically build on the land and then resell it to Canadians. So that's a good opportunity for any foreigners or anyone who is investing from overseas. Number two, non-Canadians are now allowed to purchase residential property for redevelopment. So in this scenario, let's assume you have effectively, like, the new exemption will allow a non-Canadian to directly or indirectly purchase a residential property as long as the property is acquired for the process of development. So let's assume you see a land, it's basically a residential property. Usually you are not allowed to buy that as a non-Canadian. But if you buy it for the intention to redevelop that land or basically redevelop it, build multi-story building or whatever you might want to do on a residential land, you will be able to do that as a non-foreign buyer. So basically a very good news. Again, I don't think they will still allow you to do house flipping where you technically move in, do some renovation for 6 months and then resell it. They are looking at builders who are going to be building on a residential land from scratch, build a house and then redevelop it and sell it to a new buyer. That is a very good news for anyone who is looking to invest in Canada. Number three, the third change is basically the threshold for foreign ownership used for determining whether the corporation is non-Canadian has been raised to 3 to 10%. Previously, if you have directors within Canada as well as overseas, the corporation will be considered non-Canadian if you had at least 3% of the ownership to someone who is not inside the Canada. Now that has been changed. Now the 3% threshold is removed because Canadian government understood that that is very low. So they've increased it to 10%. So let's assume if 5 people got into a project and they had a 10% partner who's a non-Canadian, even then they will be able to buy property in Canada. So again, a welcoming step by the Canadian government to help boom and basically rejig the real estate market that has been sleeping for the last I would say 10 months. Now there's 3 things that I wanted to highlight that is not talked about a lot in the news articles. So number 1 was temporary residents studying in Canada, temporary residents working in Canada, and number 3 is refugees. So if let's assume, how would that impact if someone is basically on a work permit, on a study permit, or a refugee? Can they buy it, or what are the changes? So as a temporary resident on study permit in Canada, you have to be basically enrolled into a designated learning institution. That's condition number 1. Number 2 is you must have basically filing taxes for 5 preceding tax years, and you must have lived within Canada for a minimum of 244 days in Canada, and you must have not owned any residential property in Canada before you purchase this, and the price of the property that you are technically buying cannot exceed $500,000. So let's assume you have a cousin, a nephew, or someone who is very young studying here in Canada. These are the conditions that you need to keep in mind for them to basically, before acquiring a property in Canada. There are non-residents, they were technically banned, but with the changes, if they meet these criteria of living in Canada for at least 244 days, having education in a designated learning institution with IRCC, and if the property price is less than $500,000, they can certainly buy their dream home, which is their first home. We've talked about people who are on study permit. Let's look at people who are on work permit. First of all, you must have a valid work permit. Number 2 is the validity of the work permit needs to be at least 183 days more, so at the time of purchase. And number 3, very common, you must have not owned a residential property before this. So even the work permit holders can buy it, provided their work permit is valid and they've stayed in Canada for a certain amount of time. Plus, they must have at least 183 days more added to their work permit before they are making the decision of buying their first home. So now that we have covered the residents of Canada who are on work permit, we have covered people who are on study permit. Now let's look at some of the refugees. I know in Ukraine there was a crisis going on, so Canadian government had come up with a program called Canada-Ukraine Authorization for Emergency Travel Program. So if someone is migrating from Ukraine, can they technically buy the house? Technically, yes, they can. Under this program, they are given a temporary status in the country, and because they're fleeing a crisis, they will be allowed to buy a home even though they are non-resident. So something to think about. You might have other people who have flown from other countries due to a crisis. The same logic can potentially apply for it. Can non-Canadians acquire vacant land? Prior to the change on March 27, 2023, this wasn't allowed, but now you can acquire as a non-resident. You can basically acquire a vacant land. Can non-Canadians purchase residential property for development purposes? As of March 27, 2023, you are allowed to buy a residential property for redevelopment purposes. So once again, all of these changes, all of these FAQs are for you guys handpicked to make sure it can help you, successfully close on your real estate transactions. Once again, thank you for joining in today. I know it was a very quick session, but if you have any question, you can feel free to ask them now, or you can even get in touch with me later. You have my email address and phone number.